Imagine a world where the sky never stops raining, flooded fields, destroyed crops, and the sound of empty stomachs echoing throughout Europe. Between 1315 and 1317, an unprecedented catastrophe plunged the continent into one of the greatest famines in history. Picture this: endless downpours washing away seeds, rotting what little managed to grow, and drowning the hopes of millions. For nearly 3 years, Europe endured what many believed was the wrath of God himself. But what truly caused this disaster? And how did it forever change the fate of medieval Europe? The reign began in the spring of 1315. At first, farmers weren't concerned. Rain was common enough, but days turned to weeks, weeks to months, and the rain simply wouldn't stop. The soil became saturated, unable to grow the precious wheat and barley that kept Europe's population alive. What should have been golden fields of grain became muddy wastelands. Known as the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, this crisis was the 14th century's first catastrophic blow, a century that would later become synonymous with disaster. This wasn't just a period of hunger. It was a time when the very fabric of medieval society began to unravel. Did you know that before this famine, Europe had enjoyed almost 2 centuries of relative prosperity and population growth? In fact, the population had nearly tripled since the year 1000. This boom created a Europe that was living on the edge. Too many mouths to feed and not enough land to feed them. When the rains came, this delicate balance collapsed completely. The famine wasn't just a human tragedy claiming millions of lives. It shook the social, economic, and political structures of feudal Europe to their core, preparing the ground for profound changes. Today, we're going to explore how a series of climate events and social factors transformed the continent into a landscape of desperation and death. Imagine families so desperate they ground tree bark into flour to make bread. Picture nobles watching their authority crumble as starving peasants abandoned their lands. Envision monasteries, once centers of charity, closing their doors as their own food supplies dwindled. This was Europe in the early 14th century, a continent on the brink of collapse. What makes this famine particularly fascinating is how it exposed the flaws in medieval society. The feudal system had never faced such a test, and when it did, it revealed just how fragile Europe's social order truly was. Some historians believe this famine set the stage for the even greater catastrophe that would follow 3 decades later, the Black Death. If you love history and want to unravel the mysteries of great empires at their breaking points, like this video, subscribe to the Medieval Archives, and don't miss a single episode. Join us as we journey through history's darkest moments and discover how humanity has faced its greatest challenges. It all began with a dramatic shift in climate that nobody saw coming. Imagine waking up every morning to the relentless sound of rain pounding against your wooden roof, day after day, week after week, with barely a glimpse of sunshine. This was the grim reality across Europe in the summer of 1315. The weather had gone completely mad. Where once warm summer days would ripen golden fields of grain, the summer of 1315 brought nothing but cold, damp misery. Rain fell incessantly, turning what should have been the growing season into a nightmare for medieval farmers. Fields that should have been teeming with crops became waterlogged swamps. The precious seeds that peasants had carefully planted, often saving them from their own food supply over winter, simply rotted in the sodden earth. And when harvest time arrived, there was almost nothing to gather. But this wasn't just a single bad season that people could survive by tightening their belts. The following winter proved brutally harsh, with biting cold and heavy snowfall that further depleted already scarce food reserves. When spring finally arrived, peasants desperately tried to plant new crops, hoping for a recovery. But 1316 brought no relief. Just more rain, more floods, and more failed harvests. Picture the desperation of medieval Europeans as they watched grain, the absolute foundation of their diet, turn to mud before their eyes. Bread, the staple food that provided most of their calories, became increasingly scarce. The price of grain skyrocketed, sometimes increasing tenfold in just a matter of months. For ordinary people already living on the edge of subsistence, this was nothing short of catastrophic. Medieval Europe was fundamentally an agricultural society. From the highest lord to the lowest peasant, Everyone depended on successful harvests. Even urban centers relied entirely on the surrounding countryside for food. When agriculture collapsed, everything collapsed with it. The entire continent stood on the brink of disaster. Here's something you might not know. As the crisis deepened and hunger took hold, desperate families were forced to make unthinkable choices. Household pets, once beloved companions, became potential meals. Dogs and cats disappeared from villages, slaughtered to feed starving families. Even rats and mice, normally considered vermin, were hunted and eaten. Imagine the heartbreak of parents watching their children cry from hunger, finally deciding to cook the family dog just to survive another day. In some regions, people resorted to eating tree bark, boiling leather, and searching for any wild plants that might provide some nutrition. Anything that could possibly be consumed became a potential meal in the desperate fight against starvation. What makes this even more tragic is that many of these alternative foods provided little genuine nutrition, often causing stomach pains and digestive problems that only compounded the suffering. The rains that triggered this catastrophe weren't just a local phenomenon. From the British Isles to Russia, from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean, the same pattern played out across the continent. Modern climate historians believe this marked the beginning of what we now call the Little Ice Age, a period of cooling that would affect Europe for centuries to come. But for those living through those terrible years of 1315 to 1317, it wasn't climate history. It was a fight for survival against the madness of nature itself. As crops rotted in the flooded fields, medieval Europe plunged into a nightmare of hunger and desperation. Food prices skyrocketed to unimaginable levels. A single egg could cost the equivalent of a skilled worker's daily wage. But soon, even money became meaningless, as there was simply no food to buy. Picture entire families huddled in their dark homes, trying to ignore the gnawing pain in their stomachs. They would go days without a proper meal, surviving on whatever they could find: tree bark, grass, and even clay mixed with water. The hunger drove people to unthinkable acts. In Ireland, there were whispered tales of parents abandoning their children to save themselves. Even more disturbing were the accounts of cannibalism that began to surface across the continent. What makes this famine particularly haunting is that it struck everyone, regardless of their social status. The lords in their castles, the priests in their monasteries, and the peasants in their hovels all faced the same enemy: starvation. Imagine the shock of nobles who had never known hunger suddenly finding their pantries empty. Even the church, usually a source of charity during hard times, struggled to feed its own clergy. Here's a chilling detail that brings home the severity of this crisis. In the city of Turku, Finland, prisoners in the local jail were found dead in their cells, having starved while still under lock and key. Their jailers had simply forgotten about them, or perhaps had died themselves. Death became an everyday companion in medieval towns and villages. The sound of church bells tolling for the dead became so common that some communities stopped ringing them altogether. Bodies would lie unburied in the streets, as the living were too weak to dig graves for the dead. The most heartbreaking accounts come from monastery records, where monks documented how parents would leave their children at church doors, hoping the clergy could feed them, knowing they themselves could not. But even the monasteries, traditionally the last refuge for the desperate, were turning people away, their own food stores depleted. This wasn't just a famine, it was a complete breakdown of medieval society. Markets ceased to function, trade came to a halt, and the basic bonds of human compassion were stretched to their breaking point. In these darkest of days, Europe got a terrifying glimpse of how quickly civilization could unravel when faced with the simple, primal need for food. The Great Famine didn't just empty stomachs, it shattered the very foundations of medieval society. Imagine a system that had stood for centuries, where peasants worked the land in exchange for protection from their lords. Now picture that system crumbling like a castle made of sand. The feudal lords, who once lived in luxury from the labor of their peasants, found themselves facing a brutal reality. You can't collect taxes from dead or fleeing subjects. Their grand estates, once bustling with workers, now stood eerily quiet. Fields lay abandoned, and manor houses that had been centers of power for generations began to fall into disrepair. Here's a fascinating detail from the chronicles of the time. In some regions of France, entire villages simply disappeared. The peasants, driven by desperate hunger, abandoned their ancestral homes and headed for the towns and cities, hoping to find food or work. They were willing to risk everything, breaking the sacred bonds that had tied them to the land for generations. But this mass exodus had an unexpected consequence. As peasants fled to urban areas, the rigid social structure began to crack. Think about it. When people are starving, they stop caring about social hierarchies and traditional obligations. In England, records show that some peasants began demanding payment in coins rather than accepting the old system of working for protection. They realized their labor had value, and they wanted more control over their lives. The Lord's response to this crisis reveals just how desperate things became. Some nobles tried to force their remaining peasants to work harder, leading to violent confrontations. Others, facing bankruptcy, had to sell their lands to wealthy merchants, a shocking development that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. One particularly striking account comes from the German lands, where a lord was found working his own fields, something that would have been considered deeply shameful before the famine. The old order was quite literally being turned upside down. This period planted the seeds of social revolution that would explode in the coming decades. The peasants' revolts that rocked Europe in the 14th century didn't just happen out of nowhere. They were born in the desperate days of the Great Famine, when people realized that the feudal system couldn't protect them from starvation. And here's a detail that really brings home how the famine changed people's mindsets. In some areas, peasants began forming their own mutual aid societies, helping each other survive without relying on their lords. This was revolutionary. It showed that people were beginning to imagine a world beyond feudalism. The Great Famine proved that no social system, no matter how ancient or established, could survive when people were fighting for survival. It was a harsh lesson that would reshape European society for centuries to come. The human cost of the Great Famine was staggering. Imagine walking through a medieval village and finding 1 in every 6 houses empty, their inhabitants gone forever. This wasn't just a death toll, it was the disappearance of entire family lines. Centuries of bloodlines and traditions wiped out in just a few terrible years. The numbers tell a haunting story. 15 out of every 100 people in Europe perished. But behind these statistics were real people. Grandparents who would never see their grandchildren grow up. Children who would never reach adulthood. Entire families erased from history. In some remote villages in Scotland and Scandinavia, death rates reached as high as 30%. Imagine losing nearly a third of your community, your neighbors, friends, and relatives, in just 2 years. Here's a particularly moving detail from the Chronicles. In the town of St. Albans, England, the monks kept a detailed record of births and deaths. In 1315, they recorded more funerals in a single month than they typically saw in an entire year. Eventually, they simply stopped counting, overwhelmed by the endless procession of the dead. The famine didn't just kill people directly through starvation, it created a lost generation. Those who survived were often too weak to have children, and many babies born during these years didn't survive infancy. Marriage records from the time show a sharp decline, as people simply couldn't afford to start families. Some regions of Northern Europe wouldn't recover their pre-famine population levels for nearly a century. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this demographic catastrophe was that it weakened Europe just as an even greater horror was approaching. The survivors of the Great Famine, their bodies weakened by years of malnutrition, would be the parents and grandparents of the generation that faced the Black Death in 1347. It was as if fate had dealt Europe a cruel 1-2 punch. A fascinating discovery from recent archaeological studies shows that people who survived the famine were physically marked by it. Their bones show clear signs of malnutrition and stunted growth. These silent witnesses tell us that even those who lived through the famine carried its scars for the rest of their lives. The impact was so severe that it actually changed the genetic makeup of some European populations. Scientists studying medieval DNA have found evidence of evolutionary changes that made some populations more resistant to famine, a biological echo of this catastrophe that still resonates in European genes today. In the end, the Great Famine didn't just take lives, it took away Europe's future. An entire generation was diminished, leaving fewer people to work the fields, defend the towns, or pass on their knowledge to the next generation. When we talk about 15% of the population, we're not just talking about numbers. We're talking about countless stories, skills, and traditions that were lost forever in those terrible years. As hunger gripped medieval Europe, a stark contrast emerged between those trying to help and those trying to maintain control at any cost. The response to the Great Famine revealed both the best and worst of medieval society's powerful institutions. The Church, despite its own struggles, became the first line of defense against starvation. Monasteries opened their granaries to the hungry, with some abbots even selling sacred vessels and religious artifacts to buy food for the poor. In Canterbury, England, the Archbishop ordered all clergy to give up a portion of their meals to feed the starving. There's a touching account from a monastery in France where monks reduced their own food portions to bare minimums, sharing what little they had with the local community. But even the Church's resources had limits. A particularly heartbreaking story comes from the monastery of Saint-Bertin in modern-day France, where the monks recorded having to close their gates against the crowds of starving people, knowing they couldn't help them all. Imagine being the person who had to make that decision, choosing who would eat and who would go hungry. Meanwhile, the response from many rulers and nobles was shockingly different. Instead of offering relief, they chose repression. In England, King Edward II actually increased taxes during the famine, claiming he needed funds to maintain order. Picture that, demanding more money from people who couldn't even afford bread. Some nobles went even further, hoarding grain and selling it at astronomical prices to desperate people. Here's a revealing detail from the time. In some regions, authorities passed laws making it illegal for peasants to refuse work, even if they were starving. They were more concerned with maintaining their wealth and power than saving lives. In northern France, there's a recorded instance of a lord who had his granaries full while people starved outside his castle walls. The peasants didn't take this lying down. Desperate people began to rise up against their rulers. In Flanders, starving workers stormed the homes of wealthy merchants who had been hoarding grain. These rebellions were usually met with brutal force. There's a grim account from Bavaria, where a group of peasants who broke into a noble's granary were hanged, their bodies left as a warning to others. But perhaps the most damning response came from some city authorities. Rather than helping the rural poor flooding into their cities, they simply closed their gates, leaving people to die outside the walls. In some cases, they would send armed guards to drive away the starving crowds, treating hunger as a crime rather than a crisis. The contrast between these responses had lasting consequences. People began to question why the Church, for all its faults, could find ways to help while their rulers seemed interested only in maintaining their own comfort. This breakdown in trust between the people and their secular leaders planted seeds of dissent that would grow into major social upheavals in the coming decades. A particularly ironic twist comes from a chronicle in southern Germany, where a noble who had refused to share his grain stores during the famine later had to flee his own castle when his starving subjects finally revolted. His granaries were full, but he had lost something far more valuable: the loyalty of his people. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 was more than just a footnote in medieval history. It was a watershed moment that forever changed the face of Europe. Like a crack in a foundation, it revealed deep flaws in the feudal system that had governed European life for centuries. Think about this. In just 2 years, this catastrophe accomplished what centuries of philosophers and reformers couldn't. It showed that the feudal system, for all its apparent strength, was as fragile as a house of cards. When nature struck, neither castle walls nor noble titles could keep hunger at bay. But there's another side to this dark tale, one of human resilience. In the midst of unimaginable suffering, people found ways to survive. They adapted, they helped each other, and they began to question the social structures that had failed them. Communities came together, sharing what little they had, proving that humanity's greatest strength lies in our ability to unite in times of crisis. The famine's legacy echoes through the centuries to our own time. Today, as we face our own global challenges, climate change, food security, social inequality, the lessons of 1315 seem surprisingly relevant. How do societies respond to catastrophic change? What happens when traditional systems fail? And most importantly, how do we ensure that history doesn't repeat itself? The Great Famine teaches us that no society, no matter how established, is immune to collapse when faced with environmental disaster. But it also shows us that from the darkest moments can come the seeds of positive change. The people who survived this catastrophe emerged stronger, more questioning of authority, and more aware of the need for social reform. Perhaps the most powerful lesson is this: in times of crisis, our choices matter. While some chose to hoard resources and protect their privileges, others chose to share and help. These different responses shaped not just their own survival, but the future of European society itself. As we close this dark chapter of history, let's remember that every crisis, no matter how severe, eventually passes. But how we respond to it, with compassion or cruelty, with unity or division, determines not just our survival, but what kind of world we'll inhabit afterward. If you found this journey through one of history's darkest hours enlightening, consider joining our community at the Medieval Archives. Hit that subscribe button to explore more fascinating stories from the medieval world. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on how societies can better prepare for and respond to crises. What lessons from the Great Famine do you think are most relevant today? Until our next historical adventure, remember, understanding the past isn't just about memorizing dates and events. It's about learning from humanity's greatest challenges and triumphs. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning from history's lessons.